I got pregnant at 16 by a married man who already had a child and a family. My name is Emily. I'm 17 years old, and I live in New York City. This city has always inspired me. It is as vibrant and dynamic as I am. I don't like to sit still. I always need something to do. I'm passionate about drawing, but that's not all that fills my life. After I graduated from high school, I went to college to become a hairdresser. However, after a while, I realized that it wasn't my thing. I got tired of boring lectures and decided to drop out. Of course, my parents were not happy, but I was sure of my decision. Now I'm doing manicures, have taken courses, and started earning money. Of course, this is not my big journey yet, but I like what I do. However, despite being busy, I have another passion: cars. My friends and I are into tuning old cars, racing, and drifting. It really gives an incredible adrenaline rush. I love this drive, although my mom often worries about me. She thinks it's too dangerous, but I can't stop doing it. My mom is 41 years old. She sits with my younger sister, Sasha. My mom worked as a lawyer for a long time, but now she only deals with her family. I also have a middle sister, Vika. She is 12 years old, but she is not my own. I have a different dad, from whom my mom left right after I was born. They divorced when I was only 6 months old, and after that, he and I didn't keep in touch. He only started showing up when I went to school, but he never kept his promises. At some point, I just stopped waiting for him and never heard from him again. I got a stepfather instead. He became like a real father to me. He and I are close. Although he is a strict man, he is not easy to deal with. He always says that I should study law, no matter what I do. My mom and stepdad are always trying to convince me that studying is the most important thing. But I don't know what I really want. I don't know what I want to be, and it's a little scary. James came into my life not too long ago. I met him when I was 14. I didn't really like him, so I blew him off. But 3 years later, fate brought us together again, and everything turned out completely different. We met by chance when I was riding in a car with a friend. Our battery was dead, and James just drove by and offered to help. I tried to ignore him, but he recognized me anyway. He offered to exchange numbers, and even though I wasn't ready for a new relationship, decided to give him a chance. James is a good guy, but there are a lot of unpredictable moments in our lives. After James offered me his help, we exchanged numbers and started talking. Honestly, I didn't expect it to make a difference, but every day I found it easier and easier to talk to him. He wasn't the way I remembered him, and I felt like there was more between us than just a chance encounter. We started spending time together, sometimes just driving around New York City at night, listening to music, and talking about everything. He talked about his life, about growing up in Brooklyn, about his family, and I began to see him as someone I could share my thoughts with. James turned out to be a true mechanical professional, and his passion for cars was on par with mine. He even offered me a chance to visit his garage with him to help him with a project. I couldn't refuse. It was a chance to feel like I really knew what I was passionate about. One day, we went to a small town where James had been living for a while. I knew that he had recently gone through a divorce and that it had not been easy for him. His ex wife, Julia, couldn't understand his hobbies, and they fought a lot. I didn't want to pry into his personal life, but there was something about the look in his eyes that said he needed time to realize and rethink things. It was just the two of us then, just talking about life. And I realized that he was much closer to me than I thought. He was not only a good mechanic, but also someone to just be myself with. At that point, I hadn't decided to call it a relationship yet, but there was something about James that made me reach for him. He wasn't perfect, of course, but he made me feel safe and understood. A few weeks later, we weren't just talking anymore. I realized that I really liked him, and when he wasn't around, I felt a little empty. We spent time together, often reminiscing about our first meeting and laughing about how unexpected it was and how long we'd both been avoiding each other. James said he never thought I would be the person he wanted to spend more time with. But despite all the good things, I could sense that his past was still holding him back. Even though he was trying to move forward, I could see how his memories of previous relationships sometimes prevented him from being really open and honest with me. It wasn't easy, but I had faith that he would become more open every day. Somehow, I was starting to get used to James becoming an important part of my life. He and I laughed, shared lots of ideas, and even started thinking about the future. But there was still that little voice in my head that told me that a relationship with him could be complicated. James became more and more important to me every day. We continued to spend a lot of time together, and I felt like we were becoming more than just friends. He was becoming the kind of person I wanted to share everything with, both my joys and my worries. But soon, I began to notice that our relationship was not as simple as I would like it to be. His past, which he tried so hard to put behind him, still showed it in his behavior. James continued to drink despite his promises. He would say that it didn't matter, that we would be fine, but every time he got drunk, he became a different person. He became aggressive, irritable, and sometimes just lost his temper. It didn't happen often, but as soon as I noticed he was intoxicated, I would start to worry. I tried not to show him how much it bothered me. I was ashamed of him, and I didn't want others to notice. But one day, when he and I met up again after his next drunken night out, I felt like I couldn't ignore it anymore. He came to me with an apology, but there was no sincerity in his eyes, and I realized that he wasn't ready to change yet. Each time he became drunk, I became more and more afraid. Afraid that one day his aggression would go beyond what I could forgive. And then one day it did. He and I had a fight, and his anger came out on me. He raised his hand to me. I didn't even expect it to happen. He always said he loved me, that he would never hurt me. But in that moment, I realized there was no truth in what he said. I was in shock. The words wouldn't come, only the pain in my chest and the tears I couldn't hold back. James tried to justify himself, saying he was drunk, that it was an accident. But I realized that if I stayed, it would happen again. I could no longer trust a man who was willing to raise his hand to me, even if he was drunk. I felt like I had lost something important. I didn't know what to do. I tried to convince myself that he would change after all, that it was just an accident. But as I sat in the silence of his apartment, I realized that it didn't have to be like this. I couldn't believe I'd fallen in love with a man who could hurt me. I spent that evening in complete contemplation. I realized that I couldn't go on living in such fear. Something inside of me had broken. I knew that the relationship with James couldn't last, but at the same time, I was scared to take a step into the unknown. Leaving him, leaving this world I had spent so long building was scary, but I knew it had to be done. I could no longer afford to be in a relationship where I felt threatened. where I felt humiliated, even if it wasn't often. As I thought about it, Kelly came to my rescue. I couldn't hide my worries any longer. She was my closest friend, and she always gave me sincere advice. She understood me without words. When I told her what had happened, she just looked at me with such sadness in her eyes, as if she knew that everything could not be undone. She did not judge me, but her silence ends was a clear warning. I realized that I couldn't continue this fight that was taking my strength. For too long, I had tried to deal with this loneliness by trying to justify his behavior, but deep down, I knew James wouldn't change. He was attached to his past, and despite all the promises he made, he continued to destroy everything we had built. I came to a decision. I couldn't afford to be with a man who not only undermined my emotions, but threatened my safety. I realized that the time for forgiveness had passed. My feelings for James were still there, but I could no longer turn a blind eye to what was happening. I had to leave. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't believe it right away. I thought it was impossible, that I could not be in a position. At first, I thought that the delay was just a glitch in my body, that it was nothing. But when those days didn't come, I started to worry. At first, I tried to calm myself down, but the longer I waited, the clearer it became that something was wrong. I decided to take a test. My heart raced as I looked at the stripes on the test. One was bright, and the other was barely visible. I couldn't believe my eyes. It meant only one thing. I was really pregnant. For a while, everything around me became unimportant. I sat there staring at the stripes, not knowing what to do next. My first feeling was panic. I wasn't ready for this. At that moment, I felt like my life as I knew it was over. It wasn't that I didn't want a baby, but I knew I didn't have the stability to be a good mother right now. My relationship with James was very unstable, and I had no confidence in him. He drank a lot, sometimes became violent. We didn't live together, and his family, well, that was another story. I decided to tell him. When I told James, his reaction wasn't what I expected. He wasn't stunned or worried, but rather his eyes lit up. He said he wanted a baby, that we could handle it, but there was something confident in his words that made me doubt. He seemed genuinely excited, but I couldn't forget how often he promised to change his behavior and then went back to his old habits. I didn't know what would happen next. He and I hadn't discussed how we would live our lives, what would happen to us if the baby came. I was scared, not only because I was pregnant, but also because the future seemed so uncertain. At some point, I felt like it was changing everything. My world was different from what it had been before. I couldn't answer myself exactly what was going to happen next. I wasn't sure about James, and my surroundings weren't stable. But at the same time, I felt like I had a responsibility. A baby is not just a plan for the future, it's a little life that I'm responsible for now. And all I could do was try to make a decision that would give us a chance to be happy. Mom wasn't thrilled with what I had told her. She tried to talk me out of making any hasty decisions. I could see in her eyes that she was worried about me, about the future. She kept saying that I needed to think about what I was going to do with the baby before I made a decision. At that moment, I began to realize how difficult it was to be an adult. I wasn't ready to be a mother, but I couldn't take a step back and give up what was already starting to happen. James and I continued to talk, but I began to hear more and more uncertainty in his words. He promised that everything would be okay, but I felt like he didn't fully understand the complexity of the situation. I began to fear that his promises were just words and that I would be alone when things got serious. Every day, I felt more and more how important it was to make the right decision, but I was at a loss. My mom told me that we could help me with the baby, that if I decided to keep him, everything would be okay. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that my life had changed forever, and I couldn't go back to the way it was before. A few weeks passed, and the situation was getting more tense by the day. I tried to convince myself that everything would be okay, that James would change and become the man I'd always dreamed he would be. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was pointless to hope for that. He was still drinking, still aggressive, and unsure of his future. His promises over and over again didn't hold up. I was beginning to realize that I couldn't continue to live like this, especially with a baby on the way. But no matter how hard I tried to find excuses for his behavior, I couldn't turn a blind eye to the obvious. Every time he came home drunk, every time he started yelling at me, I felt something inside me break. This couldn't go on. I couldn't be with this man, even if he told me he loved me, even if he promised to make things right. By the time I made my decision, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't keep lying to myself that everything was going to be okay. I couldn't hope that one day he would change because, in fact, he hadn't. My life couldn't be built on illusions and the hope that the future would work itself out. I had to make a decision for me and for my future child. I decided to leave. I couldn't afford to live in constant fear and uncertainty. My baby deserves stability and love, not chaos and fear. When I told James I was leaving, he tried to justify it, saying that things would change, that he wouldn't drink, that I should stay for his sake, for ours. But I couldn't believe it anymore. I couldn't expect him to change anymore. I realized that this decision was the right one, even though it hurt. With each day I spent in this stressful state, I became more and more confident in my decision. I knew it would be difficult ahead, but I could no longer continue to live in a toxic relationship. My child deserves better, and I deserve better too. After I left James, I felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from me. Even though I was scared and lonely, I began to realize that I had made the right move. I was determined to move forward despite all the difficulties. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, I could feel my inner peace returning. I was no longer afraid of being broken again, as I had been before. First, I went back to my parents. My mom, although she was worried about me, was there for me, ready to support me. She understood that I did not do it for my own sake, but for the sake of our future with the child. I moved into my old room, but it was different now. The whole time I stayed with James, I couldn't find peace. But now I felt like there was a place where I could relax and pull myself together again. Work became my salvation. I continued doing manicures and soon started getting regular clients. It wasn't as easy as I thought it would be, but every successful manicure, every smile from a client gave me confidence that I was doing everything right. I even started to take my first steps into self employment by renting a small place to work. Even though I was mostly concerned with myself and my future, I also had to think about James. He kept trying to get back to me, texting and calling, trying to convince me that things would be different. But I didn't believe in his promises anymore. I knew that if I gave in again, everything would go back to the way it was, only worse. And frankly, I wasn't ready to put up with his destructive habits anymore. I loved him, but I couldn't be with him anymore. It was too hard. Kelly, my friend, was there for me, helping me support my decision. She told me that I deserved better, that I should be thinking about my future, about my baby, not about what might happen with James. At some point, I realized she was right. I couldn't allow myself to go back to the world I had left. I could no longer allow my child to grow up in that atmosphere. I had to be strong, not only for myself, but for him as well. Even though I didn't know what was going to happen next, I felt that I was on the right track. There were still a lot of questions: how I would get on, where I would live, how I would balance work and motherhood, what would happen to James and his attempts to win me back. But I knew one thing: I would no longer sit in the shadows. I would not let my fear run my life. I couldn't let everything I had been through go to waste. I decided to fight for myself and my baby, and that decision gave me the strength to go forward. It had been a few months since I'd left James, and I was beginning to feel like my life, despite all the difficulties, was finally starting to stabilize. Every day was getting easier. I found my rhythm. Working as a manicurist brought me pleasure and money. And more importantly, it helped me not to think about the past. I learned to take care of myself, my future, and my child's future. From the very beginning, I knew that the most important thing for me was to provide stability and security for the baby. My inner feeling that I was doing the right thing kept me going despite all the difficulties. My mom, although worried about me, understood that I had to go my own way. Every day I grew stronger, and her support, even if not always straightforward, helped me move forward. The process of moving to a separate residence that my mom and I had planned began slowly but surely. I realized that I needed to create a space where me and the baby would be safe, where there would be no toxic influences. Despite my desire for independence, I realized that I couldn't immediately live on my own just yet. And I decided that it would be best to stay with my parents until I found a stable job and could fully provide for me and the baby. James kept trying to contact me. He wrote to me, called me, but I didn't believe his words anymore. He kept saying that he would change, that it would get better, but I had heard those promises before. I realized that they were just words, and they couldn't convince me anymore. He was the part of my past that I had to let go of. And while I still felt love for him, I knew it was unlikely he would ever change. I couldn't afford to go back to that world where passion and love mixed with violence and disappointment. One day, at some point, I realized that I had accepted my life as it was. I could not continue to live in illusions and hope that something would change. My future depended only on me. I made the decision to be strong and go forward. I was ready to face any difficulties and fight for my child's happiness. I knew that I had support, that I could cope with this world. As time went on, I felt my life starting to make sense more and more. Although I was still worried about my financial stability and future, I had a new goal: to make sure my child grew up in an environment of love and security. This became my primary motivation. I continued working as a manicurist, developing my small business, and it was getting easier every day. I learned to plan my time, to combine work and taking care of the baby. I often sat in the kitchen thinking about how I was going to be, but at some point I realized that I didn't want to think about the past all the time. I decided that I would move forward, one step at a time, without looking back. My future depended only on me. And then one day, Sitting in my cozy corner in my parents' house, I felt movement in my belly. It wasn't much at all, but I felt my baby begin to move. It was a moment I will remember forever. It was a small miracle that gave new meaning to my life. I felt that everything I had experienced was necessary to realize that I could cope with any difficulties. I continued to prepare for the birth, learning everything I needed to know to be a good mother. I was buying things for the baby, preparing his room. It was a process that made me feel confident and prepared. I still wasn't sure if everything would be perfect, but I knew that one thing: I would do everything I could to give my baby the best start in life. I decided that things were going to be really good for me and the baby. We would be safe, surrounded by love and care. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone. My mom was there to support me, Kelly was there to help, and I was getting stronger. My life was full of surprises, but I knew that if I fought for my family, everything would work out. After all, now I have my baby, my little hope for a bright future. And despite everything, I was ready to go forward because there was no other way for me.